Japanese sailors had a name for her. They whispered it in the dark waters off Guadalcanal, trading stories that seemed impossible. An American cruiser that fired so fast her guns sounded like machine guns. A ship that could tear through the night with a sustained roar that defied everything they knew about naval warfare. They called her the machine gun cruiser. And here's the thing, they weren't exaggerating. This is USS Helena, hull number CL-50, a light cruiser that should have died at Pearl Harbor. Instead, she survived what would have killed any other ship, crawled back to fight, and returned with a fury that would terrorize the Imperial Japanese Navy. But this story isn't just about firepower. It's about something the Japanese never saw coming, a technological revolution that would fundamentally change how naval battles were fought. It's about 868 men who refused to accept defeat. And it's about a ship that kept fighting even as she sank. Our story begins not with combat, but with something unexpected. The Great Depression. December 1936. Brooklyn Navy Yard. While bread lines stretched around city blocks, something else was happening on those industrial waterfronts. The Roosevelt administration had launched a massive naval expansion program, and it was putting thousands of desperate Americans back to work. They were building ships, and one of them would become legendary. Hull number 50's keel was laid on December 9, 1936. The workers riveting her plates and shaping her armor had no idea what they were creating. They needed jobs. America needed ships. What they built was an instrument of survival. This was USS Helena, a St. Louis-class light cruiser designed with a philosophy that challenged everything the Navy brass believed about warship design. While most admirals still worshipped battleships and their massive armor, Helena represented something different. Speed, overwhelming firepower, the ability to dance with death. Let me show you what made her special, because the numbers tell a story. 608 feet from stem to stern, 61-foot beam. She was sleek, fast, and built to punch way above her weight. But here's where it gets interesting. Her main armament. 15 6-inch guns and 5 triple turrets. Now, lots of cruisers had 6-inch guns. What made Helena different was how fast she could fire them. The Mark 16 guns could cycle rounds at a rate that seemed physically impossible. In perfect conditions, each barrel could fire 8 to 10 rounds per minute. Do the math. That's potentially 150 shells per minute from her main battery alone. Most cruisers managed maybe 60 rounds per minute total. Helena could more than double that. This wasn't incremental improvement. This was a fundamental reimagining of what a cruiser could do. Add 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 4 Parsons turbines pushing 100,000 horsepower, top speed, 32.5 knots, range, 10,000 nautical miles. She could hunt anywhere in the Pacific and outrun almost anything that could hurt her. But specifications only tell part of the story. What made Helena truly special was her crew. 868 officers and men who would transform steel into legend. Helena slipped into the East River on August 27, 1938. The champagne bottle that shattered across her bow was supposed to bring good luck. Whether it worked depends entirely on how you define luck. After commissioning in September 1939, Helena's early career reads like a peacetime travelogue. She sailed to Uruguay, where her crew encountered something that would haunt them. The wreckage of the German pocket battleship Graf Spee lay in Montevideo Harbor, scuttled after the Battle of the River Plate. The twisted metal, the evidence of violent death. Young American sailors stared at that wreckage and wondered if they were looking at their own future. By September 1940, Helena joined the Pacific Fleet. For over a year, she perfected her craft in Hawaiian waters. Gunnery drills, damage control, navigation, the endless repetition that transforms civilians into warriors. As 1941 drew to a close, Helena entered Mare Island Navy Yard for upgrades. The Navy fitted her with new 1.1-inch anti-aircraft guns. It was like giving a boxer brass knuckles just before a street fight. They were preparing for something. They just didn't know it would come so soon. December 7, 1941. Helena rested at berth 1010 in Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. Across the harbor, battleships sat in neat rows along Ford Island. The battleship Pennsylvania, mighty queen of the battle line, was supposed to occupy Helena's berth. But the dry dock needed Pennsylvania more urgently. That twist of scheduling would save Pennsylvania, and it would forge Helena's legend in fire. At 7:57 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led 9 Kate torpedo bombers toward what he believed was Pennsylvania. Through the morning haze, Helena's profile looked close enough to seal her fate. Only the lead plane released its weapon. A Type 91 torpedo carved through the harbor's water at 40 knots, passing beneath the mine layer Oglala moored alongside. And then it struck. The torpedo hit Helena at frame 75, just below her armor belt. The explosion ripped through her engineering spaces like a giant's fist. Engine room number 1 and boiler room number 2, spaces where men had been standing seconds before, transformed instantly into twisted metal tombs. Seawater rushed through a hole large enough to drive a truck through. 40 men died in those first seconds. Another 100 were wounded by the blast, by flying metal, by scalding steam from ruptured pipes. This should have been where Helena's story ended. But here's the thing about this ship and her crew: they refused the script. Within 2 minutes, 120 seconds, something remarkable happened. Her forward diesel generator roared to life. Power flowed to her gun mounts even as the ship listed and water flooded her hull. As Japanese planes wheeled overhead for their second attack, Helena's anti-aircraft guns spoke their defiance. 4 bombs straddled her during that second wave. Each near miss showered her decks with steel fragments. Men operating her guns fell dead or wounded. Others stepped over their bodies to keep firing. In the wardroom, blood mixed with oil as medical teams worked frantically. On deck, gunners stayed at their posts even as their shipmates died around them. The Japanese pilots reported Helena sinking. They made a terrible mistake. They had awakened a sleeping giant's little sister, and she would remember. In the aftermath, Helena resembled a patient in intensive care. Water sloshed through her wounded hull. Emergency pumps worked around the clock. Damage control parties shored up bulkheads. But beneath all that damage lay something the Japanese hadn't counted on: a heart that refused to stop beating. By December 9th, just 2 days after the attack, Helena limped into dry dock number 2. Navy Yard workers swarmed over her like surgeons attending a critical patient. The temporary patches held. In January 1942, Helena began her journey to Mare Island Navy Yard in California. That voyage tested every weld and rivet. Pacific swells pressed against her patched hull, searching for weakness. Her crew stood vigilant, ready to shore up any breach. They needn't have worried. Helena was tougher than she looked. At Mare Island, Helena underwent something that went far beyond repair. The Navy had learned brutal lessons at Pearl Harbor, written in the blood of 2,403 Americans. Helena would benefit from that education. Her old conning tower gave way to an open bridge where officers could see the entire battlefield. Where outdated anti-aircraft guns had stood, crews mounted 4 quadruple 40mm Bofors guns, Swedish-designed democracy wrapped in American steel. But the real revolution came in electronics. And this is where everything changes. Helena received the new SG Surface Search Radar, a technological marvel that would fundamentally transform how she fought. This wasn't just an upgrade. This was the difference between fighting blind and seeing through darkness itself. Combined with new FC and FD fire control radars, Helena could now track targets, calculate firing solutions, and engage enemy ships in conditions where visual spotting was impossible. She could fight at night, the Japanese Navy's preferred battlefield, and win. Think about what this means. For months, the Japanese had owned the night. Their crews were trained in night combat. Their optics were superior. Their tactics were proven. But radar changed everything. Helena could see ships at 27,000 yards in pitch darkness. She could fire accurately while the enemy was still searching for her position. The technological balance had shifted. The Japanese just didn't know it yet. Under Captains Robert H. English and then Gilbert C. Hoover, Helena's crew trained with fanatical intensity. Gunners drilled until they could load and fire in their sleep. Damage control teams practiced until their responses became automatic. Every man aboard understood their mission. They weren't returning to the Pacific as repaired machinery. They were returning as hunters, and they had accounts to settle. By July 1942, Helena was ready. As she passed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge bound for the South Pacific, some crew members waved at loved ones on shore. Others stared westward toward the enemy who had drawn first blood. The machine gun cruiser was heading to war. The Solomon Islands in late 1942 were hell. America and Japan were bleeding for every yard of jungle. Guadalcanal, with its crucial Henderson Field, had become the war's grinding wheel. And every night Japanese destroyers and cruisers raced down the slot, the channel between the Solomon chains, to reinforce their garrison and bombard American positions. They called it the Tokyo Express. And it was working. The Japanese owned the night. Until they didn't. By October 1942, Helena served in Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Norman Scott. Unlike many American admirals still thinking in terms of battleship lines, Scott understood something crucial. Radar and rapid fire would rule these waters. He drilled his ships relentlessly in night combat. But he made one curious decision. He chose USS San Francisco as his flagship instead of radar-equipped Helena. That decision almost cost him everything. October 11th. American reconnaissance spotted Admiral Aritomo Goto's force steaming toward Guadalcanal. 3 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, carrying reinforcements and bombardment shells. Scott positioned his force off Cape Esperance ready to spring history's trap. As darkness fell, Helena's SG radar operator, Radioman 3rd Class Robert S. Brown, hunched over his scope. At 11:25 p.m. a phosphorescent blip appeared, enemy ships at 27,700 yards. Helena had found the Japanese before they even knew Americans were hunting. This was radar's promise, fulfilled. What followed was organized chaos shaped by technology the Japanese didn't know existed. Scott, operating blind on San Francisco, ordered a column turn that accidentally placed his force across the Japanese T, the perfect position for naval ambush. On Helena's bridge, Captain Hoover grew increasingly frustrated. His radar showed enemy ships at 5,000 yards, point-blank range. His fire control had calculated the perfect solution. His turrets were trained on the enemy. But Admiral Scott hadn't given permission to fire. Helena's gun crews waited, fingers on triggers, shells loaded, watching targets that couldn't see them. Finally, at 11:46 p.m., Scott sent an ambiguous "Roger" to another ship's query. Captain Hoover interpreted it as permission to engage. Helena's turrets erupted in violence. The first salvo caught the heavy cruiser Ioba completely unprepared. 6-inch shells, each weighing over 100 pounds, slammed into her bridge at 2,500 feet per second. Admiral Goto died instantly. The captain was wounded. Japanese sailors scrambled to battle stations, confused and terrified. Admiral Goto's last words reportedly were, "Baka Yaro," roughly, "stupid bastard," because he thought his own ships were firing on him. He never imagined Americans could strike from darkness with such precision. And then Helena showed them what she could do. Her guns achieved rates of fire that seemed physically impossible. Spent brass casings rolled across her decks like golden rain. Loaders worked in perfect synchronization, feeding shell after shell into breaches that cycled faster than most crews believed possible. The sustained muzzle flashes lit up the night like a strobe light. From the Japanese perspective, it must have looked like multiple ships firing simultaneously, or like some new automatic weapon the Americans had secretly developed. This was where Helena earned her nickname. This was where Japanese sailors began whispering about the machine gun cruiser. The heavy cruiser Furutaka tried to shield the flagship. She sailed directly into Helena's steel hurricane. Helena's shells found Furutaka's torpedo tubes. The long-lance torpedoes, Japan's most feared weapon, exploded on their own deck. The detonations ripped through the ship from the inside out. Furutaka burned like a Viking funeral pyre. She would sink before dawn, taking hundreds of men with her. The destroyer Fubuki tried to mount a torpedo attack. Helena's secondary battery spoke next. At close range, the destroyer didn't stand a chance. She went dead in the water, burning. In 14 minutes, it was over. Helena had fired over 1,400 rounds. Her gun barrels glowed cherry red, hot enough to feel the heat from yards away. The Battle of Cape Esperance was America's first clear-surface victory against the Imperial Japanese Navy. And Helena had proven something crucial. American cruisers could fight, and win, At night, on the enemy's chosen battlefield, using technology the Japanese couldn't match. As dawn broke, oil slicks and debris marked where Japanese ships had died. Helena's crew, exhausted but exhilarated, had their first taste of victory. But here's the thing. Their most legendary battle was just 1 month away. November 1942 brought desperation to both sides. The Japanese prepared a massive reinforcement convoy, including 2 battleships sent to pulverize Henderson Field into rubble. If those battleships succeeded, American air power in the Solomons would be finished. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force stood as the only barrier. And like Admiral Scott before him, Callahan made the same critical mistake. He chose San Francisco as his flagship instead of radar-equipped Helena. On the night of November 12th to 13th, Helena's radar again proved prophetic. At 1:24 a.m., her SG scope detected Japanese ships entering Iron Bottom Sound, the waters off Guadalcanal that had earned their grim nickname from all the wrecks littering the bottom. 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, leading a bombardment force meant to destroy Henderson Field. What erupted at 1:48 a.m. was less a battle than a brawl with 14-inch guns. The American column practically collided with the Japanese force. Ships fired at point-blank range, sometimes just hundreds of yards apart. In the darkness and confusion, ships couldn't tell friend from foe. Searchlights stabbed through the night. Star shells burst overhead. Tracers crisscrossed like deadly fireworks. This was chaos. This was hell. This was naval warfare at its most primal. But Helena had an edge the Japanese couldn't see. While other ships struggled to identify targets through darkness and gunsmoke, her fire control tracked Japanese vessels with electronic precision. She opened fire on what her crew believed was battleship Hiei at just 4,200 yards. Her rapid-fire salvos walked up and down the enemy's length, sparking fires and explosions with every hit. The destroyer Akatsuki made a decision that killed her. She illuminated Helena with her searchlight, trying to help other Japanese ships target the American cruiser. For a few seconds, Helena stood spotlit in the darkness. But Akatsuki had just painted a target on herself. Every American ship that could bear immediately concentrated fire on the illuminated destroyer. Helena's 6-inch shells joined 5-inch and 8-inch rounds in a convergence that defied description. Akatsuki literally exploded. Not sank. Exploded. The combined fire detonated her magazines and torpedoes simultaneously. The destroyer vanished in a fireball visible from Guadalcanal, taking all but a handful of her 197-man crew. Helena shifted to rapid fire against 3 more destroyers. Her guns cycled so fast that Japanese survivors would later report believing Americans had developed some new automatic cannon. The sound, that continuous roar instead of measured salvos, convinced them this couldn't be a normal cruiser. 1 destroyer limped away, burning. Another went dead in the water. The 3rd fled into darkness, trailing smoke. Through it all, Helena danced between salvos. Her engineers pushed her turbines past their rated limits. Her rudder answered instantly to every helm order. She zigged and zagged through a storm of steel, somehow avoiding the shells and torpedoes that should have killed her. After 40 minutes of point-blank savagery, the Japanese withdrew. Battleship Hiei, battered by dozens of hits including many from Helena, lingered behind with jammed rudders. American planes would finish her the next morning, the first Japanese battleship lost in World War II. Helena emerged with 1 man dead and minor damage. Her gunners had fired over 1,500 rounds. Her barrels were shot out from sustained fire. But she had helped stop the Tokyo Express cold. Without that bombardment, Henderson Field survived to launch the planes that would savage Japanese transports over the coming days. Helena had proven herself again. A light cruiser had helped defeat battleships, but the cost grew steeper with each battle. And the crew knew their luck couldn't hold forever. Between the legendary battles that made headlines, Helena lived a grinding routine that tested men as thoroughly as combat. The Solomon Islands offered no respite. If Japanese shells didn't kill you, malaria might. If malaria didn't, dysentery would. And there was always the stress, constant vigilance that aged men beyond their years. Helena's crew developed what would later be called the 1,000-yard stare. Life aboard followed the rhythm of war. General quarters at dawn and dusk, days bombarding Japanese positions, nights patrolling the slot, radar operators straining for the first glimpse of enemy vessels. But here's what's remarkable. The crew developed their own culture born of shared danger. The ship's laundry somehow maintained pressed uniforms even after battle. It became a point of pride. Helena's sailors looked sharp even in a war zone. The ship's band, Helena's Hottentots, played swing music on the fantail between actions. Their jazz carried across the water to other ships, a reminder that civilization still existed somewhere beyond the war. Food was whatever supply ships brought. Spam, powdered eggs, coffee strong enough to float a wrench. Fresh vegetables were distant memories. The ice cream maker, when it worked, produced the most valuable commodity in the South Pacific. Men would trade almost anything for a Dixie cup of vanilla. On November 23, 1942, something happened that struck the crew hard. Captain Hoover, the man who had led them through Cape Esperance and Guadalcanal, was relieved of command for failing to adequately pursue rescue of USS Juneau survivors. The crew saw it as a bureaucratic vendetta. They had just fought through hell together, and now their captain was gone over a questionable judgment call made in the fog of war. Captain Charles P. Cecil assumed command in December. He had to win over a suspicious crew who loved their former captain. Cecil would prove himself. But the transition was difficult. December 1942 and January 1943 blurred together in exhaustion. Helena bombarded Vila and Munda. She supported convoys. She chased ghosts on radar screens. Her crew became experts at reading the sea and sky. By February 1943, Helena desperately needed yard time. Her engines wheezed. Her guns showed worn rifling. Her hull bore scars from near misses. The voyage to Sydney, Australia, felt like paradise. Fresh food, cold beer, women who spoke English. For a few precious weeks, Helena's men remembered what peace felt like. But wars don't pause for liberty. By April, Helena was back in the Solomons, refreshed guns, rested crew. The island campaign continued. Spring turned to summer. American forces prepared to leap up the Solomon chain. New Georgia, with its airfield at Munda, represented the next bloody step toward Tokyo. Helena would play her part. On June 30th, Operation Toenails, the invasion of New Georgia, began. Helena provided fire support, her shells clearing jungle in 100-yard swathes. July 4, 1943. Independence Day. Helena bombarded Munda Airfield. Democracy versus fascism, traced in tracer rounds. That evening, Helena refueled at Tulagi, taking on oil and ammunition for another night's work. Intelligence had spotted another Tokyo Express run. Task Force 68, with Helena as a key component, would intercept them in Kula Gulf. The crew sensed something different about this mission. Maybe it was the full moon predicted for that night, robbing them of concealing darkness. Maybe it was reports of Japanese heavy cruisers. Or maybe it was just the law of averages. Helena had survived too many battles without serious damage. As July 5th became July 6th, Helena entered Kula Gulf for the last time. The moon rose over Kula Gulf like a spotlight, turning black waters silver. For once, darkness wouldn't protect the Americans. Admiral Walden Ainsworth led Task Force 68 into the Gulf just after midnight. Helena followed, her radar already painting contacts. The Japanese had learned from previous encounters. Admiral Teruo Akiyama's reinforcement group included 10 destroyers, all armed with deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedoes. These weapons could reach 20,000 yards at 49 knots, carrying 1,080 pounds of high explosive. More critically, the Japanese had developed tactics to counter American radar. They would fire torpedoes first, then turn away at high speed. At 1:36 a.m., Helena's radar detected the enemy at 22,000 yards. For once, Japanese radar operators matched American detection. Both sides began their deadly approach. At 1:57 a.m., Admiral Ainsworth ordered the attack. Helena's turrets erupted immediately. Her first salvos targeted destroyer Niizuki, Admiral Akiyama's flagship. Range, 11,000 yards. Niizuki never had a chance. Helena's second salvo found her. Following salvos turned the destroyer into a floating pyre. Admiral Akiyama died in the opening minutes, watching the muzzle flashes that spelled his doom. But even as Niizuki died, her sisters had launched their long lances. Nearly 50 torpedoes raced through Kula Gulf's waters toward the American column. Helena shifted fire to destroyer Suzukaze. Her radar-directed shells found the target. But she had made a critical error. Her initial salvos used flashless powder, special propellant carefully hoarded for night actions. When those charges ran out, gun crews switched to standard powder. Each salvo now lit up the night like lightning, clearly marking Helena's position for every Japanese torpedo director in the Gulf. At 2:03 a.m., Helena's luck ran out. 3 long lances found her in quick succession. The first torpedo struck forward of turret 1. The explosion was catastrophic. Either her forward magazine detonated or the torpedo's massive warhead simply obliterated everything. Turret 1, all 3 guns, all the men inside, vanished in a pillar of flame reaching 200 feet skyward. The blast rolled through the ship like a physical wave. Bulkheads buckled. Men were thrown against steel walls. Before damage control could respond, the second and third torpedoes struck amidships. These hits broke Helena's keel, the ship's backbone, the structural spine holding her together. Her engine rooms flooded instantly. Turbines screaming at thousands of RPMs died in seconds. Electrical power failed. Internal compartments plunged into darkness. Captain Cecil immediately recognized the fatal wounds. With her keel broken, the ship was jackknifing, bow and stern sections bending upward as the center collapsed. He passed the order all captains dread: abandon ship. But Helena's gunners weren't finished. Even as she settled, even as men donned life jackets, her aft turrets continued firing. Their crews refused to leave until the last possible moment. Turret 4 fired until seawater flooded the handling rooms below. Turret 5's crew manually trained their guns when power failed, firing until the list became too severe. This was Helena's final defiance, shot to pieces, broken-backed, sinking, and still fighting. The ship broke into 3 sections. The bow had already vanished. The stern, containing nearly 400 men, remained buoyant. The center section rolled over and sank within minutes. Captain Cecil went down with it. Men struggled in oil-covered water, some wounded, all in shock. Destroyers Nicholas and Radford, risking torpedo attack themselves, moved in to rescue survivors. Their crews formed human chains, pulling exhausted men aboard while their guns continued engaging Japanese destroyers. By dawn, they had pulled 739 men from the water. But nearly 500 Helena survivors remained, clinging to floating sections. Japanese float planes arrived and strafed the survivors. Men dove beneath twisted steel as bullets churned the water. Admiral Ainsworth faced an impossible choice. His destroyers had rescued 739 men, but hundreds more remained. Dawn had brought Japanese aircraft. Radar showed enemy warships still in the area. If he stayed, he would lose destroyers and possibly fail to save anyone. He ordered withdrawal. For the men left behind, July 6th became a test of endurance that would stretch for days. On Helena's floating stern section, Lieutenant Commander John L. Chu organized survivors like he was still on a functioning warship. He established watches, rationed food and water, set up triage for the wounded, maintained discipline and hope. The stern had some advantages: medical supplies, emergency rations, areas where men could get out of the water temporarily. But it was slowly settling. Everyone knew it would eventually sink. That night, 2 American destroyers attempted rescue but were driven off by Japanese warships. The survivors spent another night clinging to wreckage. But someone was watching. On Vella Lavella Island, Coast Watcher Reverend A.W.E. Sylvester, an Australian missionary who had stayed behind enemy lines, spotted the survivors. He radioed their position and coordinated with local Solomon Islanders. On the night of July 7th to 8th, 4 ships returned to Kula Gulf. Using whaleboats and rubber rafts, they pulled 165 men from the water. The stern finally sank during this rescue, as if Helena had waited to ensure her crew was safe. But 88 survivors had drifted to Japanese-held Vella Lavella. For a week, these 88 men evaded Japanese patrols with help from native scouts. They lived on coconuts and rainwater, moved only at night. Native Solomon Islanders, risking their own lives, guided them away from patrols. These islanders had no obligation to help. Helping meant death if discovered, but they did it anyway. Because it was right. On July 16th, destroyers executed a daring daylight rescue, evacuating the last survivors literally under Japanese noses. The rescue seemed too dramatic to be true, but it was real. Of Helena's 868-man crew, 168 died in Kula Gulf or during rescue operations. But 700 survived, saved by destroyer crews who risked everything, by coast watchers who stayed behind enemy lines, by native islanders who chose humanity over safety, and by their own refusal to give up. The Navy recognized Helena's service with 7 battle stars, one of the most decorated ships of the war. She received the first-ever Navy unit commendation awarded to a ship. The citation specifically mentioned Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal, and Kula Gulf. But Helena's influence extended beyond medals. Her combat experiences drove changes in American naval tactics. Her successful radar use became standard doctrine. The importance of flashless powder, written in blood at Kula Gulf, was recognized. Damage control procedures were revised based on lessons from her loss. For decades, Helena's survivors held reunions. Their numbers dwindled, but their memories remained sharp. They remembered the sound of her guns, the feel of her deck plates, the friends who didn't make it home. They remembered the pride. They had served on the ship that refused to die. In April 2018, Paul Allen's research vessel RV Petrel located Helena in 2,800 feet of water. Remote cameras revealed her hull number, 50, still visible on her stern. Her turrets remained trained outward, as if ready to resume the fight after 75 years. The discovery brought closure. It confirmed her final resting place and allowed the Navy to designate the wreck as a war grave. Today, Helena rests where she made her last stand. Coral grows on her turrets. Fish swim through her passages. But her spirit lives on. Helena's story is more than naval history. It's about what happens when determination meets technology meets human courage. Built by workers who needed jobs during the Depression. Crewed by boys who became men in combat. Commanded by officers learning to fight a new kind of war. She was democracy made steel. From Depression-era Brooklyn to the tropical waters of the Solomons, Helena embodied the American war effort. Not invincible, not perfect, but absolutely, stubbornly determined to fight. The ship that survived Pearl Harbor to become the scourge of the Tokyo Express proved something crucial. Heroes aren't always invincible. Sometimes they're simply too stubborn to quit. In an era when battleships were kings and carriers were the future, Helena proved that a light cruiser with determination could change the course of history. Her rapid fire became legendary. Her radar use revolutionized tactics. Her crew's courage inspired a fleet. The Japanese were right to fear the machine gun cruiser. But Helena was more than rapid-firing guns and advanced radar. She was 868 Americans who refused to accept defeat. Who turned tragedy at Pearl Harbor into triumph at Cape Esperance and Guadalcanal. Who kept fighting even as their ship sank beneath them. In the depths of Kula Gulf, USS Helena CL-50 keeps her last watch. Her guns are silent now. But her legacy thunders on, in every warship that uses radar to fight at night, in every crew that refuses to quit, in every battle where technology and determination overcome raw power. They called her Machine Gun, and she lived up to her name until the very end. Fair winds and following seas, Helena. Your watch is complete.